There is a particular kind of silence that does not feel empty. It feels watched. You set the phone down, and then you pick it up again without meaning to. You tell yourself you are not waiting, but your body tells the truth before your mind can dress it up. A tiny part of you stays turned toward the door, toward the screen, toward the last message, toward the shape of a conversation that never quite finished. And the strangest part is this: the more you try to act normal, the more unnatural everything feels. Because what you are really doing is performing understanding. You are making yourself soft around someone who stays unclear. You are translating their distance into patience, their inconsistency into complexity, their coldness into stress, their silence into, they must be going through something. You keep offering interpretations because interpretations are safer than the raw fact underneath them. The raw fact is that something in you is tired of excusing, tired of reading between lines that were never written with care, tired of being the only one who keeps the emotional conversation alive. And maybe no one sees that tiredness because it is not dramatic. It does not always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like calm. Sometimes it looks like the woman who says, "It's fine," with a voice that has learned how to survive. Sometimes it looks like the man who keeps the peace, the friend who always explains the other person away, the person who says, "I understand them," so often that understanding becomes a cage. That is where the mask begins. Not only their mask, yours too. Because there comes a point in any draining dynamic when understanding stops being compassion and starts becoming a performance. You do not even notice the shift at first. You just know that if you stop making excuses, the whole thing might collapse. So you keep the explanation alive. You keep the story polite. You keep the door half open. You keep the emotional weather stable for everyone except yourself. And then one day, something changes. You stop performing understanding. You do not announce it. You do not send a dramatic message. You do not give a speech. You simply stop reaching for the familiar script that has kept the dynamic comfortable. You stop explaining why they are distant. You stop rescuing their image. You stop filling in the blanks with your own hope. And at first, that feels almost rude, almost cold, almost wrong. But what happens next is revealing. The mask falls. Not because you attacked it, not because you exposed some grand secret, but because the mask was never made to survive the loss of your cooperation. As long as you were there, supplying meaning, supplying patience, supplying emotional labor, supplying the illusion that everything could still be understood, the mask had a stage. The moment you step out of the role, the face underneath has nowhere to hide. This is where Carl Jung becomes useful, because Jung understood something many people feel but cannot name. A persona can only live as long as it is fed. The persona is the social face, the role, the version of ourselves that knows how to be acceptable. Sometimes it is useful, sometimes it helps us function. But in unhealthy dynamics, the persona becomes a shield. It hides fear, need, emptiness, control, shame. It says, "I'm fine." It says, "I don't need much." It says, "I'm just busy." It says, "You are overthinking." It says, "You know how I am." And if you are the one who keeps performing understanding, you may have built your own persona too. The patient one, the emotionally intelligent one, the one who can handle more than anyone else, the one who never makes things difficult. That persona can look noble from the outside. Inside, it is often exhaustion. The deeper truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes the reason the mask falls when you stop performing understanding is because your understanding was the glue holding the whole illusion together. Not the relationship, the illusion. The illusion that if you could just be wise enough, calm enough, forgiving enough, then the other person would finally become consistent, transparent, safe. The illusion that if you keep interpreting them generously, they will eventually meet you there. But a persona cannot replace character. It can only decorate it. And if there is a manipulative pattern in the room, or an emotionally evasive person, or a relationship built on your willingness to absorb confusion, then your understanding becomes oxygen for the very thing that drains you. Not because you are weak, because you are human, because empathy naturally wants to make meaning, because the psyche hates uncertainty, and it will often choose a painful story over a blank space. That blank space is what terrifies people most. A silent message, an unread notification, a face that does not explain itself, a tone that shifts without warning, a conversation that feels warm one day and strangely unavailable the next. The unconscious hates this kind of instability because it activates old material. It does not just register the present moment, it reaches backward. It begins pulling in earlier feelings, earlier disappointments, earlier losses, earlier moments when you had to guess what was safe and what was not. This is where the complex begins. A complex is not just an idea, it is an emotional knot. It is a charged cluster of memory, expectation, body sensation, and old fear. When someone becomes inconsistent, your abandonment complex may wake up. When someone keeps you guessing, your self-worth may start bargaining. When someone gives just enough to keep you attached, your nervous system may confuse tension with connection. You do not just react to them. You react to everything they awaken. And that is why this dynamic can feel so powerful. Because you are not only dealing with a person, you are dealing with a pattern in the psyche. You may tell yourself, I just need clarity. But underneath that, there may be a younger part of you saying, please do not leave me in the dark again. You may tell yourself, I just want to be fair. But underneath that, there may be a deeper vow. If I understand them well enough, I will not be abandoned. You may tell yourself, I am trying to be mature. But underneath that, there may be a hidden bargain. If I stay reasonable, I will stay lovable. That is the wound. And the wound is not healed by making yourself even more understandable. In fact, that is often how it deepens. Because when you keep performing understanding in a place where understanding is not being returned, you begin to erase your own signal. You become fluent in the other person's confusion and illiterate in your own discomfort. You know exactly how to explain their behavior, but you cannot say plainly, this hurts me. You know how to soften the truth, but you cannot feel the shape of your own boundary without guilt. This is where the shadow enters. Jung's idea of the shadow is not that you are secretly evil. It is simpler and more human than that. The shadow is everything you do not want to admit about yourself, everything you have pushed away because it did not fit your self-image. If you see yourself as the understanding one, the patient one, the one who never abandons people, then your shadow may carry anger, resentment, suspicion, exhaustion, and the desire to walk away. If you have built your identity around being easy to love, your shadow may contain the part of you that is no longer willing to be easy at all. And that is not a failure, that is information. The mask falls when you stop performing understanding because your shadow is finally allowed to breathe. The part of you that has been swallowing the truth starts to surface. The part of you that is tired of pretending starts to speak in body language first. Tight chest, jaw tension, heavy stomach, delayed dread when their name appears, relief when they do not text, followed by shame for feeling relieved, a strange numbness after too many explanations, a sudden irritation at the sound of your own patience. Listen to that. The body often knows before the mind is ready. If the dynamic is healthy, your understanding does not cost you your center. But if your understanding is being used to keep you available, compliant, or emotionally convenient, then your body will begin to resist the role. That resistance may look like distance. It may look like silence. It may look like you becoming harder to read. It may look like the version of you they used to rely on no longer showing up on command. And that is when they often react. Not always with honesty, sometimes with charm. Sometimes with guilt. Sometimes with sudden softness. Sometimes with irritation. Sometimes with confusion that seems almost theatrical, as if your boundary has become an insult to their comfort. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They think the reaction proves love, or anger, or regret. But often it proves something simpler. Your withdrawal has disrupted the role they were accustomed to receiving from you. You were not only a person to them, you were a function. You were the one who made things feel smoother, the one who interpreted, absorbed, reassured, waited, corrected, excused, translated, and stayed. And when you stop performing understanding, the function disappears. What remains is the relationship as it truly is, without your emotional labor dressing it up. That can be shocking. It can feel like betrayal, even when you are the one telling the truth. It can feel like cruelty, even when you are finally being honest. It can feel like loss, even when what is actually leaving is a role that has been asking too much of you for too long. This is why so many people go back, not because the pattern is good, because the role is familiar. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar dignity. Familiar confusion can feel safer than clean truth. Familiar longing can feel safer than the emptiness that comes when you stop feeding a story that never fed you back. The psyche will often choose what it knows, even when what it knows is exhausting. But Jung would not ask you to worship your suffering as fate. He would ask you to look at the pattern and ask what part of you is being organized around it. What is the unconscious trying to repeat? What image of love are you trying to preserve? What old fear is keeping you in the room after the room has already become too small? There is a quiet humiliation in realizing you have been working harder to understand someone than they have been working to be understood. There is also a quiet relief, because once you see it, the burden changes shape. You are no longer trapped in the fantasy that if you just decode them correctly, everything will become clear. You begin to see that clarity is not something you can extract from another person's mask. Clarity is something you reclaim when you stop bowing to the mask. That does not mean you become bitter. It means you become precise. You stop calling inconsistency chemistry. You stop calling emotional withholding mystery. You stop calling your own anxiety intuition when it is actually a response to instability. You stop treating your capacity to endure as proof of your depth. Depth is not the same as self-erasure. Compassion is not the same as self-abandonment. Patience is not the same as permission. And yes, there may be moments when the other person looks different once you stop performing understanding. They may seem exposed. They may seem smaller. They may seem annoyed. They may seem suddenly interested in explaining themselves. They may seem to notice your absence in a way they never noticed your presence. But do not make that the center of the story. The center of the story is that you are no longer volunteering to carry what was never yours alone. That is the beginning of individuation. Individuation is one of Jung's most important ideas, and it is easy to misunderstand if you hear it as some mystical self-improvement project. It is not that. It is the slow process of becoming more whole, by separating yourself from false roles, borrowed expectations, and unconscious identifications. In plain language, it is when you stop living only as the version of yourself that keeps other people comfortable. That is not a small thing. It can feel like grief, because every role has a cost, and every role has a benefit. The role of the understanding one may have given you belonging. It may have made you feel useful. It may have helped you avoid conflict. It may have made you feel morally superior in moments when the reality was messy. Letting go of that role means letting go of the identity attached to it, and the psyche does not surrender identities easily, even when they are painful. So if you feel guilt when you stop performing understanding, that guilt is not proof you are doing something wrong. It may simply mean the old role is losing its grip. Guilt often arrives at the edge of a boundary, especially for people who were trained to be agreeable, emotionally available, or endlessly interpreting. The first time you say, "I don't think this is healthy for me," your nervous system may react as if you have committed a crime. The first time you stop explaining someone's behavior to yourself, you may feel disloyal. The first time you let a silence remain unanswered, you may feel selfish. This is where the shadow of the good person becomes visible. The good person persona can become a trap because it makes you believe that being loving means never becoming difficult. But a boundary is not a moral failure. It is often the first honest sentence your psyche has spoken in a long time. I can no longer do this. I do not want to keep guessing. I am tired of carrying the emotional meaning for both of us. I am not available for confusion dressed up as connection. That sentence may not sound beautiful. It sounds real. And reality has a strange effect on masks. It exposes them without needing to fight them. When you stop making excuses, the other person can no longer rely on your interpretation to remain coherent. When you stop performing understanding, their lack of clarity becomes visible in the light it was always avoiding. The mask falls because the room has changed. Your gaze has changed. Your participation has changed. This is why the moment of withdrawal can feel so intense. Not because you were trying to punish anyone, but because you are no longer available to keep the illusion alive. You are no longer the interpreter, no longer the emotional translator, no longer the one who makes their inconsistency sound like a temporary storm instead of a pattern. The mask falls when you stop performing understanding, because performance is what kept the mask socially acceptable. And what remains after that can be painful to see. Sometimes it is indifference. Sometimes it is entitlement. Sometimes it is fragility. Sometimes it is an emptiness that has been hidden behind confidence. Sometimes it is a person who only knew how to be close when they were being protected from the consequences of their own behavior. Sometimes it is a dynamic that was never built on mutuality at all, only on your willingness to keep making it feel mutual. That realization can hit like cold air, but cold air also wakes you up. You begin to notice how much of your energy has been spent on reading someone else, instead of inhabiting yourself. You begin to notice the places where you became so skilled at understanding that you forgot how to ask a simpler question. Do I feel safe here? Not, do they mean well? Not, do they have trauma? Not, can I explain this generously? But, do I feel safe here? That question changes everything. Because safety is not a luxury. It is a condition for real intimacy. If you must constantly regulate the atmosphere, decode the silence, and perform emotional intelligence to keep the connection from falling apart, then you are not in mutual relating. You are in maintenance. And maintenance is exhausting when it becomes your personality. The unconscious will often keep you in maintenance because it knows the old script. It knows the role. It knows how to survive by adjusting itself to unstable people. But survival is not the same as life. At some point, the psyche begins asking for more than endurance. It asks for truth. It asks for boundaries. It asks for a self that does not have to keep shrinking in order to remain acceptable. That is the deeper wound beneath performing understanding. The fear that if you stop being easy to read, easy to soothe, easy to lean on, you will become unloved. This fear is ancient. It is often older than the current relationship, older than the current silence, older than the current mask. It may come from early experiences where love felt conditional, where being good was rewarded and having needs was inconvenient, where you learned that harmony was safer than honesty. The adult situation then becomes a stage on which the old lesson repeats itself. You are not only responding to the present person, you are responding to the memory of what it once cost you to be difficult. No wonder the body hesitates. No wonder the mouth goes dry when you want to say no. No wonder you feel shaky when you stop explaining. No wonder the silence after your boundary feels louder than the argument ever did. The psyche is not only releasing a person, it is releasing a survival strategy. And survival strategies do not leave quietly. They bargain. They whisper. They say, maybe you are overreacting. They say, maybe they just need time. They say, maybe if you explain it one more time, they will understand. They say, maybe if you soften this, you can keep the connection. They say, maybe the mask is just stress. They say, maybe you are being too harsh. But the question is not whether you can keep explaining. The question is whether you want to keep paying for closeness with self-erasure. There is a moment in this process when the mask falling is no longer about them at all. It becomes about the part of you that finally refuses to be trained into confusion. That part may be quiet at first. It may not feel heroic. It may not feel empowered. It may just feel tired enough to stop. Tired enough to let the conversation end where it ends. Tired enough to stop defending what keeps hurting. Tired enough to let their silence be their silence. And that is not coldness. That is clarity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop supplying emotional meaning where there is no emotional responsibility. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let the mask fall without rushing to cover it back up. Sometimes the deepest self-respect is simply refusing to perform understanding for someone who has made your understanding a substitute for their accountability. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. Just one. Something true. Something that does not ask permission to exist. Because your psyche needs to hear your own voice more than it needs another explanation. And once you begin hearing yourself again, the whole atmosphere changes. The room feels different. Your body feels different. The phone on the table is still just a phone, but it no longer has the same power to organize your day. The unread message is still unread, but it no longer defines your worth. The silence is still there, but it no longer gets to pretend it is your responsibility to fill it. That is the beginning of freedom. Not dramatic, not glamorous, often quiet, sometimes almost invisible from the outside. But inside, something important has shifted. You are no longer kneeling before a mask and calling it understanding. You are no longer sacrificing your clarity to preserve another person's comfort. You are no longer confusing your empathy with your duty to stay available to confusion. The mask falls when you stop performing understanding, because your soul is no longer willing to be an accomplice to its own depletion. And after the mask falls, there is space. At first, that space can feel awkward, empty, too honest, too still. But space is what allows truth to breathe. Space is what lets the body unclench. Space is what lets the unconscious stop shouting through symptoms, tension, and obsession. Space is what makes room for a different kind of relationship with yourself, one built not on endless interpretation, but on presence. You may notice that you do not need to chase every explanation anymore. You may notice that your mind is less interested in decoding them and more interested in returning to itself. You may notice that your energy no longer rushes toward the next text, the next apology, the next tiny sign. You may notice that what you once called love was partly hunger, partly hope, partly the habit of mistaking emotional labor for intimacy. That realization is painful. It is also clean. And cleanliness has its own mercy. It removes the fog. It removes the theater. It removes the performance of understanding that was costing you your center. It does not make you hard. It makes you available to something better. A life where your compassion is real because it is no longer forced to stand guard over your pain. This is what Jung would call a movement toward the self, the deeper organizing center of the personality. Not the ego's image of who you should be, not the persona's polished face, the self. The part of you that knows when enough is enough, the part that does not need to keep explaining the obvious, the part that can stand in truth without decorating it for someone else's comfort. And when you stand there long enough, you realize something simple. You do not need to perform understanding to be worthy of love. You do not need to translate someone's mask into something kinder than it is. You do not need to keep your own discomfort hidden to prove you are mature. You do not need to stay in a role that drains you just because you are good at it. The mask falls when you stop performing understanding, and what remains is not emptiness. It is your life returning to you. Maybe that begins with one unanswered message. Maybe it begins with one honest sentence. Maybe it begins with a quiet refusal to over-explain. Maybe it begins with the strange relief of finally letting someone's confusion stay theirs. However it starts, let it be real. Let it be yours. And if you want a sentence to carry with you, let it be this: my kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Say it slowly. Feel what happens in your body when you say it. Because that feeling is the beginning of a different kind of understanding. One that does not perform. One that does not plead. One that does not keep the mask alive. One that sees clearly, stays grounded, and returns you again and again to yourself.